Good afternoon, sorry. I'm João from Brazil and will make the review of both teams. First I'd like to ask you, you mentioned these dissipative forces, these two dissipative forces in your problem. What are these dissipative forces? And for the point two, do you want to answer before? Because we have a short time and have to make...
I don't know what these forces are, actually.
You don't know?
No.
Okay. Do you know?
No.
Okay. Is it possible to have two different jets in the phenomenon? Yes. When is this occurs?
I actually don't know how it occurs, but sometimes there's a primary jet and then a secondary jet. As one is going up, then another one is, I think, coming.
Okay.
The answer?
You mentioned the Hertz law in the conclusion. What's the relevance of this law for the phenomenon?
It has to do with
these two jets, do you think it's possible and
Yes.
what's the relevance of it?
When the ball impacts in the sand and forms this void, we can observe a jet going upwards and a jet going downwards because the walls collapse at the central point.
Okay. You mentioned this collapsing of the void.
Yeah.
Is there any critical depth for this happens?
No.
No, there's no critical depth. Okay, do you agree?
No.
Okay. Could you quickly draw the void collapsing as you mentioned, as you asked it for her?
At first we'll have the void itself, then the void will start to collapse, and at some point we will see the void collapse and a jet coming upwards and one coming downwards in some situations.
Okay. For the reporter, after this internal jet, what happens? What's the sequence after that?
After the...
Sorry?
After the what?
The internal jet formation, what happens?
After the jet formation?
Yes, please. Can you begin?
Jets falls back.
Okay. And what happens?
For the downward jet.
Yes.
After it's formed, there is an air bubble trap inside, which goes out, and as you can see in picture 8 and 9, we see an explosion.
Did you make any analysis to analyze all the problems you mentioned? Do you have any theoretical or experimental data for this to prove this?
No.
Okay. That's it. We don't have more time, unfortunately. Thanks for all the answers. Okay, you ready?
Please start.
Good afternoon. As I said, I'm going to make the review. I'm João from Brazilian team, and I'm going to make the review of problem 14, Granular splash. First, a general view of the presentation. In the theory, they showed us qualitative analysis. In the experiment, they show us a video and a graph, but important they couldn't explain. And the conclusion, we don't have a clear conclusion for the problem. The reporter, he have positive points, he have a phenomenon explanation with a sequence of pictures. They analyze the compression of the sand and the height of launch, as we could see in the experiment. But unfortunately, we have some negative points I'd like to point. Didn't mention this critical depth for collapse that is related to parameters of descent and compression that will define if the jet will be formed or not, or this first or second jet. Didn't mention the inner jet and couldn't explain because when we have this jet formation, we have a bubble of air in the sand, and this bubble erupts. Didn't mention the particle size and the regularity of these particles that change the friction between the steel ball and the sand. Didn't mention the type of collision between the sand or the steel and the sand. The velocity of entrance, the relevance of it, and the size of the spheres. And both changing these, we have the changing of the dissipative force, also the friction and this drag force, both the friction and the force depending on the distance, and this drag force depending on the velocity of the ball. so it would be a relevant parameter. And we had no jet formation experimentally, and no analysis of the splash. You could mention, but you don't have a clear explanation of it. The positive points for the opponents, they mentioned the final eruptions, the consequence of this inner jet, the cushioning of the jet height, that was really good. They mentioned the compression of the sand, that also was really good. They asked about the function of dissipative force, although they couldn't explain what was these dissipative forces. They noted the lack of comparison between the theory and the experiment and the clear conclusion. They noted the lack of the experimental data and the particle size. But unfortunately, we also have some negative points like to say. They mentioned the dissipative force, but they couldn't explain these dissipative forces that are the drag force that's dependent of the velocity of the ball, and the friction force that is dependent of the distance of the ball, the position. They didn't notice that this lack of this explanation of the initial splash. They didn't mention the humidity of the sand that influence in the compression of it, and sometimes when you have a greater humidity, you don't have even a splash or a jet formation. The compression in the experimental data wasn't analyzed. This variation of the compression that could affect the data. The size of spheres weren't mentioned, and the type of collision weren't mentioned too. Although they should mention analyze the parameters that they only mentioned and didn't write, this was really good. A general view of the discussion, the questions of the formula he asked it. The question is about the conclusion, because we don't have the clear conclusion. Discussion about the launch of velocity control, and on a negative point, the opponent couldn't make clear the relevance of these questions. They were very current, but you couldn't make clear your point, what you want from it. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.